Good evening, Zoomers. This is Michael Humphreys of Navesink Maritime Heritage Association, and welcome to this Zoom presentation of what New Jersey is going to look like once we've got some wind farms out there helping to keep the CO2 down. I expect some of you might have read the message that's on the screen. That'll go away in a minute. And I shall be introducing Hannah Van Hemmen, who works for Ørsted, and she'll be explaining what's going on out there, what will be going on out there in the ocean. So a few housekeeping things. We will enable chat at the end of the meeting, so you can ask questions and we'll try and answer them. We are recording this, so we will try and put it back up on the website or YouTube, or if we get a decent recording. And I just want to advise you that in November, on the 15th, we will have another presentation unrelated to this. It's going to be all about French privateers off the New Jersey coast, a whole different subject, but still fits into our maritime theme. So without ado, I would like to hand over to Hannah Van Hemmen and Cara Gross, and I will just stop sharing so that Hannah can come in.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen so I can get the presentation started. Can everybody see that? Michael, can you confirm that you can see that?
Yeah, that's good. We can see it very well.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining today and being interested in the offshore wind industry that's burgeoning off the East Coast. Today we're going to focus specifically on New Jersey's first offshore wind farm, which will be located 15 miles off the coast in South Jersey. But we'll also try and cover a lot of ground on some of the basics about offshore wind, and specifically offshore wind in the US. So just bear with us. Like I said, we're going to try and keep this high level, cover a lot, so we can get some time at the end for questions. I'm Hannah Van Hemmen. I'm the Ports and Operations and Maintenance Permitting Manager for our North American projects, offshore wind projects. So I work a lot on the construction and operation of ports that will support the offshore wind industry. I'm joined today by my colleague, Cara Gross, who I think unfortunately is having some video feed issues, but her audio is good. And she is the Marine Affairs Specialist for our New Jersey offshore wind projects. So just moving along. So we've got four main questions that we're going to try and address today. The first is just why do we need offshore wind to begin with? The second is what is offshore wind? Third, who are we as Ørsted? And fourth, which is what we hope to spend the most time on, is how will we build New Jersey's first offshore wind farm? So we're going to give an overview. We're going to talk about some of the port infrastructure, which is my favorite topic. We're going to talk about some of the vessels that will be used. And then we're going to give you a brief rundown of what installation will look like. So I'll kick us off with the why question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cara for the what. So starting at the beginning with why. So let me bring up my notes. So this presentation is not about climate change. That could obviously be a whole different presentation. We all know that global average temperatures are rising. We also know that it's scientifically proven that man-made global warming is responsible for much, if not all, of this rise. So CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion is the main driver of this man-made global warming. And therefore, we must find other ways to fuel our global energy system over the long term. So ultimately, we're looking to replace green energy with the previously used fossil fuels. So The IPCC, just to give you a little bit more context, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a body of the United Nations. They have agreed upon a 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Visual.
Excuse me?
Lost visual.
You lost the deck?
It's back now, Hannah.
Okay, great, thanks. It's still there now, as I've got my notes up?
Yes, you're good.
Great. So the IPCC is a body of the United Nations. They have agreed upon a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise above pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gases as the target that we should all attempt to stay below in order to limit damage to Earth's ecosystems. So we're really trying to avoid what could happen if we go much more over that 1.5 degrees Celsius, such as massive biodiversity loss, rising sea levels and flooding, and extreme heat and drought. Higher temperatures would also mean declining fish stocks, beach erosion, further declining coral reefs, and reduced crop yields, among many other consequences. The point of this chart here is really just to show that in the blue, you can see a projection of the share of green energy that's predicted based on current policies versus the amount that would be needed to stay below that 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. So as you can see, there's a pretty big gap here of green energy that we really need to ramp out much faster than what current policies are expected to produce. So there has been an increasing share of green energy in the system, but we're just really going to need to accelerate that in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So moving past that, let me see if I can progress this slide. So there are a lot of benefits beyond climate change as well. So to name a few, air quality and human health improvements, accelerating that clean energy transition could save up to 4 million lives a year, largely through improved air quality by 2030. Domestic energy production, just our current portfolio as Ørsted of projects in the US will deliver domestically produced energy to 3.5 million homes across the US. That reduces our dependence on foreign energy that can be subject to really volatile price fluctuations. Clean energy jobs, it's estimated that the offshore wind industry in totality will create about 58,000 American jobs. Many of those jobs are union jobs, well-paying jobs that can sustain families. And finally, we're making pretty massive investments in the supply chain and infrastructure, which serves not just us, but also the maritime industry at large and many other industries as well. So Ørsted, our company, has invested already nearly $2 billion in building out the supply chain and infrastructure needed to support clean energy projects in the US. And then this is the final slide on why that we're going to get into today. I just wanted to show you guys that the green energy transition will involve a large portfolio of different types of green generation. So that's the actual energy production. One of those is offshore wind power, as many of you know, but it will involve a portfolio of many different types of energy generation. And another really key component to that green energy transition is making sure that we have methods of storage and things like fuel carriers to be able to also transition the parts of the emitters that are less easy to decarbonize. So an example of that is vehicles, where as we replace fuel combusting vehicles with EVs, we're moving them towards an increasingly cleaner grid that's being supplied by energy sources such as this, which don't emit any carbon dioxide. I'm going to pass it over to Kara now, who's going to fill us in on what offshore wind is.
Thanks, Hannah. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. How do offshore wind turbines work? To understand this, we first need to understand that electrical energy can be generated by rotating magnets inside a coil of conductive wire, and that's called electromagnetism. Conventional power sources like coal or gas heat water and use steam to drive a turbine that creates electricity in this method, whereas offshore wind uses wind, as the name suggests, to rotate the blades of a turbine and then generate that electricity. While one turbine can create several megawatts of power, when grouped together in a wind farm, they can create or generate an amount of electricity comparable to conventional power stations, but with no emissions and utilizing the unlimited resource of wind. Fixed foundation offshore wind farms, which is our focus here, are spread out over an area of ocean with a foundation firmly installed into the seafloor with a tower that extends above the water where the blades can capture wind. Next slide. Thanks. So the top of the wind turbine is the workhorse and referred to as the hub. There are two main components of the hub, the nacelle, which is on the right-hand side of this image, and then the blades and on the rotor, which are on the left-hand side of the schematic. The nacelle houses the gears and generator, and the blades will harness the wind power. And so how this works is the hub will be turned into the wind and causing the blades to spin, and that rotating motion is passed through a drive shaft to a gearbox to turn the magnets inside the coil of wire, which generates an alternating current of electricity. Next slide. In an offshore wind farm, individual turbines send their power to an offshore substation by array cables that are buried under the seafloor. The substation collects that power and gives it a little boost to send it the longer distance to shore via export cables. The landfall is the transition between the offshore and onshore components to get that power to an onshore substation. The onshore substation then converts the power to a usable voltage that can be generated or integrated into the local grid and delivered to homes and businesses. And now I'll pass it back to Hannah, who will provide some background on Ørsted and the company's involvement with renewable energy like offshore wind.
Thanks, Kara. All right, so who is Ørsted? In short, Ørsted develops energy systems. So obviously we develop offshore wind. You can see, if you want to follow along here at the bottom, the capacity that we have in various types of energy systems. So the blue is installed capacity in gigawatts, and the green that sits on top is capacity that's currently under construction that will soon be added to that operational portfolio. We also have a number of projects that are in various stages of development and moving towards construction. So offshore wind is really our bread and butter. We're the global leader in offshore wind, but we also have a pretty sizable onshore renewables presence, especially in the United States, particularly onshore wind and solar projects, in addition to some storage projects, which is the other side of that slide I was showing earlier. We also have some legacy gas activities in Denmark, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. And we are increasingly getting involved in renewable hydrogen and green fuels. So again, on that other side of the slide I was showing, the purple slide I was showing earlier, which is how they're not energy generating. It's more about how to store and move that energy around. So really decarbonizing sectors that are more difficult to do, such as the maritime and shipping industry. So we actually have a pretty interesting background as a company. So we really have firsthand experience in what it takes to transition from black to green energy. In 2000,
Oh, your screen disappeared again. It's back.
it's back. Okay. I think it's a problem with the notes when I bring them up. Anyway, sorry about that, folks. In 2006, as you can see based on this graphic, which I hope you guys can see, oil, gas, and coal were our core business. You can see that the fossil-based energy was the vast majority of our share of heat and power production. But we decided to phase out fossil fuels and significantly expand our production of green energy. So you can see that change over the years. As of 2022, we were about 90% renewable energy over our whole portfolio, our global portfolio. Alongside with, oh, and yeah, also mention we're on track to meet our target of 99% of green share of energy generation by 2025. So alongside phasing out of the fossil fuels, we've really built up the world's leading offshore wind energy business, which has made us one of the world's leading renewable energy companies. Our investments in offshore wind power, along with our partners, have totaled more than $20 billion since 2010, and really have been instrumental in developing the offshore wind industry from something that was really kind of niche to a global and rapidly growing industry with the potential to deliver green energy to hundreds of millions of people. Oh, click too much. So this is showing our US footprint, which I think is pretty cool. The stuff in blue is stuff that's in operation. So you can see we've got a pretty big portfolio of onshore wind and solar projects that are actually already up and running. They're clustered more in the middle of the country where there's a lot more open land, and they obviously don't have the ability to install offshore wind, unlike us who have an ocean right next door to be able to put those assets out a little bit further away from population centers. So you can see as well that we have a number of projects currently under construction, including one of our offshore wind projects, South Fork Wind, which is moving along out there. And then we have a number of projects under development, including a number along the east coast of those offshore wind projects that we're talking about. Today, we're going to focus on Ocean Wind 1, which is this one. So just to reiterate a little bit, we've got over 30 years of experience building offshore wind farms. We built the first offshore wind farm in the world. We own and operate America's first offshore wind farm, which is Block Island Wind Farm, which actually is pictured here. So that's been in operations for a while. We also total 28 successful offshore wind farms with over 1,500 turbines installed worldwide and have the largest project portfolio in the US. So that's who we are. Next, I'm going to turn it back over to Kara for the beginning of how we're going to construct New Jersey's first offshore wind farm.
Thanks again, Hannah. Okay, so move on. Yeah, thank you. In the U.S., offshore wind wouldn't be anywhere without the leadership of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, which is the federal agency that oversees the development for offshore wind. They consult with other federal agencies and coordinate with local governments to provide actions, authorizations, and guidelines for this industry. Next slide. So this is an overview of the federal process that begins with investigation into call areas and ends with the installation of a project. It's a multi-year process, as indicated on the timeline, with some phases taking several months and others taking years. First, large areas of the ocean that can be considered for offshore wind production are identified by BOEM, and they evaluate the wind potential, environmental factors, and other ocean uses based on data analysis and public input. These call areas are then refined into wind energy areas, which are placed up for lease auction that companies will bid. Once a company obtains a lease area, several years are spent in developing a project proposal, which is then submitted to BOEM as the Construction and Operations Plan, or COP. In accordance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the COP undergoes a thorough independent environmental review by BOEM and its partnering agencies to investigate the potential impacts of the project. These impacts must be addressed by the developer within their proposal, and the project will commit to many measures to minimize those projected impacts before the COP is approved. The NEPA process takes over 2 years to complete and includes several opportunities for public engagement and comment. Similarly, the project proposals undergo review from other federal and state agencies that also include public comment periods prior to respective permit issuance. To put this timeline into perspective, for Ocean Wind 1, which is the project we're talking about today, Ørsted leased a portion of the New Jersey wind energy area in 2016. Ocean Wind submitted their COP for BOEM review in late 2020, and the NEPA process kicked off in spring 2021. The environmental review was completed in July 2023 with a record of decision for the project, and final COP approval was received on September 21st. So now Ocean Wind 1 is just one step away from installing the wind farm. So where and what exactly is Ocean Wind 1 besides New Jersey's first offshore wind farm? You can see in this image, it's located, the lease area is indicated in blue, and the project area is that darker blue, located 15 miles offshore of southern New Jersey between Atlantic City and Stone Harbor, and will consist of 98 turbines and 3 offshore substations. The Board of Public Utilities approved this project in 2019 to deliver 1,100 megawatts of clean energy to the New Jersey grid, which could power up to 5,000 average homes. The project is dedicated to investing in the state's local economy and building out a supply chain and workforce to support the green energy transition. Next slide. This is a closer view of the wind turbine layout, which has been adapted from an arrangement that will optimize wind yield to this uniform grid pattern that runs in a northwest to southeast direction with a 1 nautical mile by 0.8 nautical mile spacing between the turbines. An optimized wind layout would typically have a packed border of turbines that are spaced closely together, and other turbines will be in a seemingly erratically placed within that border to maximize the wind capture. However, after extensive consultation with stakeholders, and this fishing industry in particular, whom expressed the need to safely transit through the lease area to their offshore fishing grounds, the project shifted to this arrangement we see here. As you see, there are clear lines of transit between the turbines in several directions, and these are consistent with typical transits from major fishing ports. We also coordinated with the neighboring developer to the north of our lease area, Atlantic Shores, and the U.S. Coast Guard to adjust the positions of some turbines at the border to provide a more pronounced boundary between the projects. Additionally, the project conducted a thorough navigational safety risk assessment that's included in the application, and lighting, marking, and other navigational aids on the structures will be done in accordance to U.S. Coast Guard guidelines. Next slide. So this gives an overview of our cable routes. So within that gridded layout I showed on the previous slide, there are 3 offshore substations, which will send power to shore through 3 distinct cables over 2 cable routes. The northern cable route makes landfall at Island Beach State Park before crossing Barnegat Bay to connect at the onshore Lenoka substation, which is formerly Oyster Creek Nuclear Power Plant in Lacey Township. The southern route will make landfall at Ocean City's 35th Street and lead to Peck Bay, which is formerly the BL England Coal Power Generation Facility in Upper Township. The cables will be buried underground, both the onshore and offshore components, with the exception of some overhead lines that connect the onshore substation to the grid. Both onshore and offshore cabling was routed to minimize disturbance to the local landscape and avoid sensitive habitats as much as possible. Next slide. Ocean Wind broke ground in Atlantic City about a year ago to begin building an operations and maintenance facility, which will support this project as well as others. This month, we began onshore construction at our Lenoka substation, and the landfall on Island Beach State Park is scheduled to begin within the week. Offshore construction, though, won't begin until the spring of next year. The time that it will take to install all the components of this wind farm, the 98 turbines, 3 substations, an array and export cables, as well as adhering to some time of year restrictions and following the our permit application, puts our projection for final commissioning of this project in 2016. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to Hannah, who will talk about a little bit of the how we will deliver on the Ocean Wind project, and she will focus on ports and vessels.
Thanks, Kara. So I'll start off with ports, which is my personal favorite topic as someone that's working on the port development. So this is more of my day job. So there's a lot of different ways we're involved in ports as Ørsted. So the East Coast is a really busy place for ports. When the industry started thinking about how we were going to construct wind farms on the East Coast, it involved a lot of exploration and feasibility studies to see where we would even be able to operate out of. So we're involved in some of that like early development stuff. Once we select sites, we're involved in the design and construction of those ports, sometimes with a number of either public or private partners, which then get handed over to the execution teams that will operate on the ports. So we'll maintain the ports while we're installing the wind farms themselves and during commissioning. And finally, we're going to retain some of those ports to be used for maintenance and operations throughout the life of the wind farm. There's a variety of different port types, as you might imagine, that support different scopes. So 3 main buckets here. The marshalling ports are the ports where a lot of the components are brought together to be staged. There's some pre-assembly done there, and then they're loaded onto vessels, which then bring those components out to the wind farm to be installed. Also investing in a number of supply chain ports. So supply chain ports are where we manufacture domestically components of the wind farm. And then finally, I'd put in a bucket light logistics facilities, which includes the O&M facilities that we'll use throughout the length of the project, which often are also suitable to be used as what we call construction management bases, where we'll operate some of our vessels out of and do crew transfers and supply transfers out to the wind farm during construction. So I wanted to show you guys some cool photos of what we've been doing on the ports front. There's a lot going on in New Jersey right now to be able to support this new infrastructure. So this is an aerial of New Jersey Windport, which we're partnering with New Jersey EDA on. So they're constructing the wind farm, or excuse me, they're constructing the port. We will be their first lessee, and this is where Ocean Wind 1's marshalling activities are going to happen out of. This is situated on the Delaware Bay here. Here's a rendering of what it will look like when complete. You can see a bunch of components here on the quayside and upland area. These ports are generally pretty heavily reinforced to be able to accommodate that weight. And you can see it's also directly adjacent to the Salem nuclear plant, which is operational, which is pretty cool as well. Paulsboro is one of the sites that we've made a lot of investment in with both public and private partners. So EEW is a private company that we're working with, as well as South Jersey Port Corporation, who's the owner of this site. So here we're actually manufacturing monopiles, which is what you can see here. There's buildings constructed. Not all of this has been constructed yet, but phase 1 is complete, which is where we do welding and painting and blasting of those monopiles, which will, some of which will go out to Ocean Wind 1 to be driven into the seabed. Kara will talk more about that installation in a little bit. And phase 2 will involve even more steel bending and some other really cool things to be able to domestically produce monopiles. So as Kara mentioned earlier, this brings a lot of jobs to New Jersey, both temporary jobs to construct the port and permanent or long-term jobs to continue to manufacture components for the industry. And so as you can see here, this is actually a real photo at Paulsboro Marine Terminal, where we've got a monopile going into the paint and blast building. And so things are happening. This is a picture of our O&M facility, which is currently under construction. So this one is owned outright by us. We are working with a local construction contractor who is building it for us. And they're well underway at this point. We've got a warehouse and office space going up. We also, you can see the quayside here. This is where CTVs can berth, which is one of the primary vessels that we'll use for our operations and maintenance, which I'll get into in a little bit. Another cool thing about this project is that per our CAFRA permitting, we're building a public access park, that will ensure waterfront access for the local community. We're also installing a wetlands area for the local ecology in the area. So it's really cool to see, because this is a previously industrial site that had been abandoned and it's sitting around, that was used for oil and gas industry. And we were able to bring more life back to the waterfront and incorporate both our local stakeholders and local environment along the way. This is a rendering of what the warehouse and office space will look like once constructed. Moving on to vessels. I'm not going to cover all of the vessels that will be used for construction and operations, but I'm going to try and touch on a few key ones, especially some of the exciting stuff we have going on with construction of domestic vessels that will be Jones Act compliant. So a great example is the CTVs that I alluded to earlier. That stands for crew transfer vessels. They also generally transfer small parts and supplies between the wind farm and the port. these vessels, we've already chartered some. We have some in operations now in some of our Northeast projects. We are chartering additional vessels to support Ocean Wind 1. The Jones Act, for those of you who aren't familiar, is an act from 1920 that mandates that any transfer of goods between U.S. ports will be on vessels that are built in the U.S., they're U.S. flagged, and they're U.S. crewed. So, so we're really, now that offshore wind is coming to the U.S., we really have to build up that vessel inventory as well. So it's exciting that we're starting to see some of these new builds come out of these U.S. shipyards. The CTVs will support construction and operations phases of Ocean Wind 1. They'll be approximately 100 feet long, and they'll draw between 5 to 10 feet. It's also worth noting that since some of the port areas that we're redeveloping haven't been used for a while, we're also working with the Army Corps of Engineers to make sure that there's enough depth in the channels to be able to support the boats that we'll be bringing in. And where there isn't, we've been working with them collaboratively to try and work on dredging projects and fund where necessary. So it's cool as well to see that, again, the maritime industry at large will benefit from the revitalization of some of the infrastructure that we have here on the East Coast. Also, just to give you an example of another type of vessel, although an SOV will not be used for Ocean Wind 1 on a regular basis, is SOVs. So those are service operations vessels. We are constructing one currently that will be chartered by us for our Northeast projects. It's the first ever Jones Act SOV. It's being engineered, constructed, and operated by Edison Schwest. And it's being built at domestic shipyards in Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana, creating more than 300 jobs. Also noteworthy is that a lot of the suppliers for major components will be domestically sourced as well. So for example, North Carolina for the steel and Illinois for main engines. So this one that's pictured is 260 feet long, housing 60 passengers. Finally, I'll just make a quick call out about construction vessels before I turn it back over to Kara to close us out with installation. So there are a variety of different types of construction vessels that will be used on the project. The installation vessel pictured here is called Skyla. Her US flagged sister vessel, Charybdis, is currently being constructed and is already contracted by Ørsted, as well as some other East Coast wind developers. So that vessel will be worth about $500 million and will operate as part of Dominion Energy's assets. The vessel will be 472 feet long. It's being constructed in Texas and will use domestically sourced steel. At peak construction, 1,000 U.S. workers will be employed on this project. And once it's complete, the vessel will be home ported in Virginia. So just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the vessels that you might be seeing offshore and in some cases at some ports as well. And then I'll turn it back over to Kara, who is going to give us a high-level overview of how we're going to construct the wind farm offshore.
Thanks, Hannah. You can switch to the next slide, please. So first, I want to touch on surveying, which occurs during many of the project phases, and including the mapping of the seafloor to inform project design, and also during the construction phase to do things like ensuring the cable burial depths were achieved. And then once operational, we also conduct some surveying to ensure that the cables remain buried, particularly after powerful storms. In some of these surveys, we utilize high-resolution geophysical survey techniques that use acoustic equipment to map the seafloor. And while some of the acoustic sources operate at frequencies that are detectable to marine mammals, most of the equipment used for offshore wind surveying emits directional, low-power signals that operate at high frequencies, which is above the hearing range of most marine mammals. Federal agencies have determined that no injury to marine mammals or protected species is expected from these HRG sources, as the sound has been shown to diminish rapidly with distance. Other concerns are mitigated by having protected species observers on the HRG survey vessels. In compliance with regulations set by the National Marine Fisheries Service, these observers actively look for whales, dolphins, and other protected species in the vicinity of the vessels. And they direct the vessel to conduct an array of mitigation measures where appropriate to prevent the impacts, which can include a change of course or a shutdown of the relevant sound sources. Additional mitigations are in place as well, such as vessel speed restrictions. But for a comprehensive list of all these mitigations that can be found in the permits that are issued to the project. Geotechnical surveys take core samples to examine the soil composition and their operations. Produce no sound considered impactful to marine mammals. The soil samples are analyzed and used to inform the design of foundations, which are built uniquely for each location. Next slide, Hannah. So while fixed bottom offshore wind can utilize one of several styles of foundations, the ones that will be installed for Ocean Wind 1 are monopiles. The steel tubes will be loaded onto barges at port and ferried out to the site, where they will meet an installation vessel. That vessel will be stabilized on site and will use a crane to lower the foundation into the water, and then a hydraulic hammer to drive it into the seabed. This component of construction does emit underwater noise, so sound dampening measures are put into place to mitigate impacts. One such noise reduction technology is a bubble curtain, which pushes pressurized air through openings and hoses to disrupt water around the pile driving and dampen the sound pressure waves. The next slide. So following the installation of the foundation are the components that you see out of the water, including the transition piece, tower, and hub. These components are brought to sea in individual pieces and assembled on site. Safety is always our top priority, so we only undertake these activities in appropriate weather conditions with detailed preparation, careful testing of the stability of each component before executing the next step. Next slide. So here you can see a wind farm under construction. In the foreground, there's a monopile foundation topped with a transition piece that includes a platform, which is where the crew accesses the wind turbine for servicing. In the background, you can see a jackup installation vessel that has attached the tower, nacelle, rotor, and blades to complete this turbine. The parts remaining on the installation vessel or for other turbine locations. The vessels themselves can carry components for 3 to 4 turbines at a time. Next slide. The offshore wind substations are installed similarly to the turbines, with a monopile foundation in the case of Ocean Wind 1, and a topside, which is where the work happens with at the substation. As I mentioned previously, these substations will collect the power that's generated by the turbines through array cables and transform the power to a higher voltage before sending it to shore through export cables. This boost in voltage means that less energy will be lost over the long distance it needs to cover to shore. Next slide. So those offshore cables will lead to the landfall, which is where it transitions to onshore cables. The landfall installation for ocean wind is being done by horizontal directional drilling that starts onshore, creating a small tunnel that is several dozen feet under the beach and leads about 300 yards offshore. After the drill makes it to the exit pit on the ocean side, a conduit will follow it back to the surface on the land side. Once this conduit is fed through the HDD bore, it'll be capped and wait for the cables. So this process for the Limoca cable will commence soon, but the cabling won't occur until likely I believe next year. And next slide. Right, so I want to finish this presentation with some of our resources. The Ocean Wind Project has a website, oceanwind1, all spelled out, .com. That has some great information about the project, and it will be updated regularly through construction. And you can also sign up to receive those updates via email. And the project also has a hotline and email address that can be used anytime for general questions or comments. Additionally, the Marine Affairs team has a webpage, us.orsted.com/mariners, that houses information relevant to our on-water activities that will be of interest to other mariners. If you there you can find our mariners briefings, which are updated twice a week and posted on the site. We also distribute those via email, and you can sign up for that distribution list through that website. I want to thank you again for attending and apologize for the technical glitch with my camera and Zoom. So I'm not able to be on camera tonight, but I think the NMHA is going to open the chat function for some question and answers, but I will pass it back to Michael to give some instructions about how that is going to get started.
Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I'm sending out a message to everybody via the chat system. I'm going to ask you to send all of your questions to myself via chat. And in a moment, we're going to open up a chat to have those questions to myself. I will summarize. I'm certain we'll get some questions that are repeats of others. So I'll write them down and summarize them and provide them to Hannah and Kara for asking. One moment, I'll get the chat window open. Let's see, where was that settings?
I think you've got to go down to security.
Yeah, there it is, got it, yep. Hang on, laptop is, there it is. Let's see.
Everyone.
No, participant, that's it. All right, please start sending me questions.
The first question is, would you please describe your green energy program from Steve Knowlton? Anna or Kara?
I didn't hear you. No.
I'm sorry, the question was, can you please describe your green energy program?
Yes.
I can go, am I still sharing my screen?
We see you on the camera.
Just me, okay. Let me take the presentation out of presentation mode. And I can go back to the slide and maybe share it again about our green energy portfolio. Is that what the question was referring to?
Yes, please.
Okay. So if this is sharing, which it should be, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So our at Ørsted, our green energy portfolio is made up of primarily offshore wind. So we've got 9 gigawatts of installed capacity globally. So that's, as I was mentioning earlier, that's our bread and butter. That's the main way that we are involved in the green energy transition. But we do have a growing portfolio as well of onshore wind, as well as solar PV projects and storage projects. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also starting to get involved in this sort of renewable energy and green fuels space, and phasing out the remaining legacy gas activities that we have that emit CO2. Sitting on top of all that, I mean, like, our green energy generation is really what we do. But we also have our own internal targets to decarbonize our supply chain, and decarbonization of some of the methods that currently emit CO2 while we're constructing some of these projects, which are a very small proportion of what we end up then reaping the benefits of once those projects are operational. But we want to fully decarbonize all the way along that supply chain too. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but feel free to leave something else in the chat if you want more clarification.
Another question: how far offshore are the substations, and will they be seen from the beach?
I don't know the exact distance from shore, but the first row of turbines is located at 15 miles offshore, and they're in the second row of turbines. So that would be about another nautical mile offshore. And the visualization of the projections of the whole lease area is that there will be some rows of turbines, or there will be some visual impacts to areas along the shoreline. And so I would believe that within that second row, there could be, in some areas, potential to see those offshore substations as well.
And we can bring up some of the visualizations. I'm still showing my screen, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
You're not in present mode.
From current slide. So this is, they won't be visible from the Barnegat Light. That's one of the locations. These are technically supposed to be printed on 11 by 17 inch paper, and you're supposed to hold it a certain distance away to be the most accurate, but I think this still gives you a pretty good idea. So they won't be visible here. It also obviously depends on the conditions, the weather conditions here, which is pretty much, I think that's the closest possible position. This is 15.21 miles away in the very middle of the day. This is what they will look like from the playground pier in Atlantic City. This is from Stone Harbor in Cape May County on obviously a very clear day. So again, like you can see a little bit there. I hope you guys can see. And finally, the Cape May Lighthouse. You wouldn't be able to see it at all without magnification, but if you magnify 4 times with binoculars or whatever, you'll be able to see them turning out there, which is kind of cool.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, since we are in Monmouth County, the Navasink group talks about, what can you tell us about upcoming projects, if any, that will be visible off the Monmouth and Ocean counties?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't, I don't personally know all the activities of our of some of the other developers that are developing wind farms, but I will say that I think the one that would be closest to Monmouth County would be Empire Wind, which, let me see, I think I had a good New Jersey DEP website link that I can share with you guys that does kind of aggregate all those different offshore wind projects in New Jersey and where they will be located. Yeah, let me throw that in the chat now if I'm able to do that. Chat. Everyone in meeting. So this is New Jersey DEP's website that shows all the different leaseholds that are currently awarded. So that one, Empire Wind, I believe would be 20 miles east of Long Branch.
Okay. Okay, and next one, Ocean Wind 1 has applied for 15,000 or so take authorizations to harass, harm, or injure different species of marine mammals, to include endangered species according to the Federal Register, Volume 87, number 51 and 206. How do you capture that data to ensure compliance with the number of takes the author company has been authorized?
Kara, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
I'll start and you can fill in if I'm missing anything.
Okay.
So within our permits and our COP approval and all of our permits, we are committed to having a series of mitigation measures to reduce any impacts to marine life, including marine mammals. And there will be reporting requirements if there is any sighting of a marine mammal and any documentation of the mitigation measure that may have been taken at that sighting. We also will be deploying some acoustics receivers so that we can track the movement of some marine mammals. It is, I believe it's species specific, that, you know, they capture the sound of animals, and that'll feed into kind of the national tracking of this too. But it will better make our vessels more aware in a real-time manner as the location of marine mammals. And then we can react accordingly. You know, if our operations are nearby, then we'll, you know, again, proceed accordingly to the measures that were put in place by the federal government and agencies that have reviewed our application. And just act appropriately to minimize those impacts.
Can you also clarify what a take authorization is specifically?
So the take authorization is an approval that is given for, that's through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a lot of any businesses that are operating on the water kind of have to go through this approval process, and it reviews the potential impacts to marine mammals in particular, with as a review of the operations that we have proposed. And so their take authorization has the estimated I guess, clearance of, whatever those numbers are. I haven't read through it myself. It's not my area of expertise. And I don't believe it's not Hannah's either. So, we do have authorization to perform under the conditions that are in that. I do know that the authorization is also detailed to say that they don't expect there to be any permanent damage or injury to any animal caused by any of the construction operations that we will be doing, as long as we're adhering to all those mitigation measures.
Yeah, and then I just build a little bit again on, I'm going to share my screen again. So I can't, and I don't think Kara can really speak super well on the take authorization specifically, because that's other folks that do that type of permitting. That's not us. But we can certainly take that back to our colleagues and ask and circulate a more robust answer on that back to you guys. I know that like there's like a misnomer that means that that's like the number of animals that are going to be killed, which is certainly not. It's any sort of allowed impact on an animal. So just to kind of go into the second part of the question, I think, which was about compliance. We have all sorts of reporting requirements per our construction and operations plan, and that are mandated by BOEM and the consulting agencies in the record of decision and the final environmental impact statement. So we've got still a lot to do in terms of creating plans that are mandated per that permitting, and implementing long-term environmental surveys and mitigation projects, and then translating all of that into a compliance regime. So to date, we've got 1,800 conditions to be implemented during compliance. And so we've got to prepare guidebooks for all the contractors. We've got to have compliance management tools and regulatory conditions databases, and really make sure that we've got quality assurance and control on all of that stuff, to be able to ensure that we're executing the project exactly as we agreed upon with BOEM and those consulting agencies.
Do you know what to extent the completed projects, when all are permitted and constructed, will meet New Jersey's carbon emissions reduction targets?
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Do you know to what extent the completed projects, when all are permitted and constructed, will help New Jersey meet carbon emissions reduction targets?
Yeah, so I don't have, I think, the number that you're looking for exactly, but I think you might know that, or maybe not, that the Biden administration has committed to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So this project is 1.1 gigawatt. So really, like, even just on that individual project, we're making a dent in that commitment that's been made federally to achieve 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. But projects like this are happening all up and down the East Coast, not just by us in Ørsted, but also by other wind developers. So yeah, we've got a pipeline to move towards that 30 gigawatts by 2030. I do also know that, as Kara presented earlier, this project will supply electricity to 500,000 homes. So what's the population of New Jersey? 8 million? Is that right? If that's right, then this project alone, the Ocean Wind 1 project, will again start to make a dent in at least the electricity need, noting that that electricity need is expected to go up over the long term. I hope that was enough to sort of get you towards the answer to your question.
Someone wants to know, how do you sleep at night knowing that each one of you has destroyed our ocean and all its life?
Oof. Yeah, actually, this project is expected to have a net benefit on marine life. So that's why we're working so hard to build it. In a lot of different ways, it's expected to have a net benefit. One of those, obviously, is stemming the rapid changes to the oceans that are happening as a result of climate change, which is really concerning. And as I mentioned earlier in the slide deck, we really need to accelerate that clean energy transition in order to avoid the serious biodiversity losses that we face if we start creeping up too high in average global temperatures. So that's a huge component of it. But even if you're just looking purely on a biodiversity front, we're expecting that that these offshore wind projects will have a lot of benefits there as well. So, for example, these the foundations that Kara described that get driven into the seabed, our experience in Europe as Ørsted has shown that that a lot of those foundations turn into artificial reef structures that then many species attach to and then draw further fish and other wildlife once they're constructed. So actually out in Europe right now, when they're looking at decommissioning some of these projects that have gone through their full lifespan, we're obligated and plan to completely remove the project once it's at the end of its life. But there's been discussion with some of the regulators about, well, maybe we don't want to remove the foundations because they've got valuable artificial reef structures sitting there below the surface. So it's nice that Europe is starting to have those conversations already so that we can make sure that we retain the biodiversity gains that we get from these types of projects. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, how do you account for all the whales and dolphins that have already washed up on shore?
I'm happy to take that question, but Kara, I know you can take that question too if you want. I don't care.
Again, yeah, I can start and then feel free to fill in. So as I mentioned in the presentation, our survey activities were deemed by the federal government to not have any impacts to, have no injury to marine mammals or protected species from the sources. And that has gone any time we operate in our survey. It does go through a federal review process. And additionally, I know that we had some vessels out on the water early this year, but the last vessel until very recently left, or that was operating for our company, finished up at the end of January. And again, we went months without any vessel activity on the water. And so I, from a firsthand standpoint, we can't say what exactly is causing the whale deaths. And I think that the federal agencies and state agencies are looking for an answer, and our necropsies are still being evaluated, or the necropsy results are still being evaluated as to the cause of deaths for all of these individuals. But predominantly, it seems like there were indications of some pre-existing diseases in some of these animals, as well as indications for vessel strikes.
Yeah, I'll fill in now. I'm also going to put some links in the chat again. So every major government agency, including the Marine Mammal Commission, whose mission is to provide independent, science-based oversight of domestic and international policies and actions of federal agencies addressing human impacts on marine mammals and their ecosystems, has concluded that there is no evidence to link the strandings to offshore wind energy development. So actually my sister, some of you might know, runs a whale watching program for a company in our area. So this is dinner table talk for us very often. But the decline in, not decline in whale population, because the whale populations are larger than we've seen in a long time in our area. But the strandings that we've been seeing, we can't say what they're from. The necropsies from those strandings, about 50% of them show evidence of vessel strikes. But as Kara mentioned earlier, again, there's a lot of misinformation floating around when it comes to any sort of connection between offshore wind and whales, particularly when it comes to the surveying efforts that we do. In oil and gas, they use really loud seismic blasting to map the seafloor, to really penetrate miles deep in the seafloor. That's not the type of survey work that happens here. The survey work that we do is actually the same kind of survey work that the Army Corps of Engineers has been doing for many, many years in order to map the seabed for beach replenishment programs and identify sand resources for shore protection. So basically there isn't anything new happening with offshore wind, with the exception of those additional vessel trips, which will be about like 2 to 3% increase in offshore vessel activity. So Ørsted's undertaken like a lot of mitigations to be able to ensure that our vessels don't hit any whales. One of those is speed restrictions. So some of you may already be aware that there are 10 knot speed restrictions at certain times of year while protected whale species are migrating, particularly the North Atlantic right whale. So of course we observe those speed restrictions. We also comply with time of year restrictions, which Kara already mentioned, which avoid major periods of fish spawning and marine mammal activity. We actually also have dedicated observers per our permits that their only job is to be on the vessel and look out for marine mammals, both visually and using various tracking resources that we have. And when appropriate, as Kara already mentioned, we pause any investigation work and construction activities when marine mammals or sea turtles enter exclusion zones that we've set up. So for example, when we're driving those foundations into the seabed, if a whale enters the exclusion zone, we just stop work and wait for that whale to leave. I know we threw a lot of info at you on that one. I'm gonna just put a few other links in the chat too, if you guys want to look at more.
Okay, next, what impact might Ørsted's current financial troubles have on the company's ability to finish the project?
Yeah, I think we're both a little afraid of this question because we're not finance people in the company. We can certainly bring that question back to folks internally and provide a response to NMHA for circulation. Kara, do you have anything you want to say on that question?
Sure. As I'm sure this question is alluding to our recent announcement of an impairment. And what the result of that is, as was in that announcement, is that our the date of our project completion will be set back a little bit until 2026, when previously it was projected at 2025. And so there's no indication that there's going to be an end to this project at this point, or a stop work for this project, but that partially, or the causes of the impairment are troubles with the supply chain, and so that is one of the biggest factors that would be moving our project completion a little bit past where we initially planned.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that like these are problems across the industry with offshore wind in the US and the East Coast that are in this stage of development. It's just that the financial environment that we're in right now is really tough to build large infrastructure projects. So with inflation and supply chain increases, it's really put pressure on the profitability of some of the projects based on the agreements that we've already inked with the states.
Okay, next question is, the 500,000 homes is it supposed to be at max capacity? Because the quote is, turbines rarely run at full efficiency, usually at a rate of 30%. What is the average number of homes that will be provided electricity when the turbines are running at their usual efficiency, if that's the actual number?
Yeah, I believe it. Go ahead, Kara.
Sure. So that estimation there is for an average home, and like with average usage of electricity, and that would be based off of that 1.1 gigawatt value, and yeah, that's the extent that I understand that that number was generated from.
So is that 1.1 gigawatt the full capacity or the expected capacity?
I believe that's the expected capacity. I would also just note on reliability that here, I'm going to share my screen again because I've got another relevant slide for this. There's a lot more resources about this on the Ørsted website if you guys want to poke around. But this is for other offshore wind farms where we've done this data analysis. Obviously, there's not a lot of data to work with in the US yet, but offshore wind turbines do generate power almost all of the time. Sometimes there's too little wind, and occasionally there's too much wind, so we shut them down to avoid damage. But based on average figures from an analysis that Ørsted did on wind farms in the North Sea, there was enough wind for production 91% of the time. Obviously, in that clean energy future, we're expecting to have electricity grids that are supplied by a mixture of different power sources, so that we've always got something producing power. I know that doesn't really answer the question, but we can also get back to NMHA on that 1.1 number, whether that's expected. I don't know the answer offhand.
Okay, we get a lot of questions about the decommissioning of these once their term is up. What process and projects do you have in place to ensure that they're cleanly decommissioned at the end of their service life?
Yeah, that's all outlined in our construction and operations plan, interestingly. So even like 30 years out from needing to decommission these things, we have a general plan in place for what we're going to do. So you can the COP is like 1,000 pages long, but you can look for the sections on decommissioning, and I can put the link to the COP in the chat too. I'm not sure if I have it offhand. But yeah, we're expected to return the leasehold the way it was. So removing the turbines, and also expecting to use a lot of the same ports to bring them back in. Another thing, actually, let me share the slide deck again. Something that's like kind of been a hot button item is the recycling of the blades. So can you guys see this slide? So currently about 95% of what wind turbines are made of can be recycled. But Ørsted has also made a commitment to find the right recycling solutions for the final 5% too. So we're no longer going to send any blades to landfill. So there's only one farm that we fully decommissioned so far, and that one, 98% of the composite material was either recycled or used for research or exhibition, including all the turbine blades. But from now on, that number is going to be 100%. And that applies to our onshore wind projects as well.
All right. Tara, Hannah, thank you very much for your presentation. I know there's a lot more questions out there. We encourage everyone who has more questions to reach out to Ørsted directly through the links provided by them in the presentation. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and have a good evening. And we look forward to seeing some of you or all of you at our next presentation in November.
Thanks for listening, everyone.